They say the mind can only hold so much before it breaks. And yet, some truths exist that aren't meant to be understood. They are meant to shatter you. In 1921, in the small, fog-choked town of Ashbourne, Pennsylvania, 2 children were born who would defy every law of nature, every rule of reason, and every comforting belief you hold about life itself. The Harper twins. Identical, inseparable, yet not the same. There were whispers even before their first birthday, whispers the townsfolk tried to ignore. At night, neighbors swore they heard them speaking in a language that no one had taught them, a language older than any living memory, yet unmistakably deliberate. They claimed things, details about strangers' lives, secrets that no child could know. They predicted events with eerie precision, some so grotesque and specific that people began to fear them as a kind of living oracle. By the time the twins were 5, a pattern emerged. Each child would display a personality and knowledge the other lacked, as if a hidden switch flipped between them. One would recount the past with terrifying accuracy, murders, betrayals, hidden sins of the town, while the others seemed to live entirely in the present, yet could mimic emotions, words, and expressions with unnatural fidelity. Their parents tried to shield them, to keep them hidden from the world, but the attention was inevitable. Scientists arrived, drawn by a morbid curiosity, desperate to dissect and classify the phenomenon. Psychologists, parapsychologists, even clergy, each claimed they could explain it. None could, and each encounter left them unnerved, their minds recoiling from the twins' uncanny awareness. But here's what the textbooks never told you. Behind the fascination, behind the polite veneer of study, there was a darker force at play. Observers began reporting a sense of manipulation, a subtle, invisible pressure in the room when the twins were present. Decisions were influenced, confessions were extracted. It was as if the children were conduits for a knowledge no adult could possess without consequence. Some who came seeking scientific answers left haunted, their lives unraveling in ways that seemed orchestrated by the twins themselves. Tonight, we descend into that shadow, the hidden corridors of the Harper twins' lives, the secrets their parents tried to bury, and the forces that science and society alike refused to name. What you're about to hear is not merely history, it is a warning. Once you step into this truth, there is no turning back. The Harper twins are not a story. They are a doorway. And if you listen closely, you might feel the pull yourself, like a whisper brushing against the back of your mind, beckoning you to see what no one else will ever admit exists. By the time the Harper twins reached 7, the world around them had begun to warp. Friends and family noticed subtle distortions in reality whenever the children were present. Small objects moving without explanation, doors left open, shadows that seemed to linger longer than they should. But these were only the surface cracks. The real terror was in their words. They began to speak of events that had not yet happened, tragedies that would strike the town, secrets of the adults whispered in hushed tones, private sins laid bare before an audience too shocked to respond. People laughed nervously at first, dismissing it as coincidence. But the coincidences mounted. A neighbor, convinced the twins were harmless, mocked them at dinner one evening. The next day, his house burned in a fire no one could explain. The whispers began in earnest after that night. Teachers reported that the twins sometimes switched personalities mid-class. One moment, Emily Harper, the older by minutes, would be timid, shy, a child in every sense of the word. The next, she would recite information about classmates' families, their hidden debts, betrayals, and mistakes, as if reading from a script no one had given her. Her brother Edward would watch silently, a knowing smile on his face, then repeat the same, information in his own voice, correcting details with chilling precision. Psychologists called it shared consciousness. Locals called it something far older and far more dangerous, unnatural. No one wanted to admit the truth, but it was clear the Harper twins were changing the people around them. Men and women found themselves confessing sins to these children, revealing secrets they had guarded for decades. Friends turned on friends, families fractured, and the town itself seemed to shrink under a silent, invisible weight. Something about the twins exposed the hidden machinery of human behavior, a lever on the mind that no one should touch. And yet, here it was, right in the middle of Ashbourne, staring back at anyone bold enough to meet their gaze. It was during this period that the first serious investigation began. A psychologist from Philadelphia arrived, armed with journals, tests, and a desire to catalog the phenomenon. But within hours, he began to behave erratically, questioning his own memories, his own sanity. By the time he left town, his professional reputation was ruined, and the twins? They said nothing, yet everything had changed. It was as if the children themselves orchestrated the unraveling, teaching a subtle lesson in fear and obedience. They had become a living mirror, reflecting the darkest truths of everyone around them. We are only beginning to scratch the surface. Behind the innocent faces of these children lies a mechanism of influence so potent, so forbidden, that it challenges the very notion of reality itself. If you think you are ready to see beyond, to follow the Harper twins into the hidden corridors of power, manipulation, and ancient whispered knowledge, then steel yourself. The next section will reveal the first secret their parents tried and failed to keep hidden from the world. The Harper parents, Margaret and Thomas, were ordinary people, or at least they tried to be. Farmers, dutiful, respectable, the kind of townsfolk who believed in hard work, church on Sundays, and keeping their children out of trouble. But no amount of piety or discipline could contain what they had brought into the world. From the moment the twins began speaking in that impossible language, from the moment they predicted the fires, the betrayals, and the accidents, Margaret and Thomas understood they were not raising ordinary children. They were raising a force they could not control, a conduit for knowledge no human was meant to possess. Late at night, they would whisper to one another, terrified, about the things the children had said that day. Secrets revealed, sins confessed, futures outlined. Margaret would shiver, clutching her shawl, afraid even to look at Emily for fear the girl's eyes might pierce through to some truth she was not ready to confront. Thomas, once a practical man, began to question everything he had ever known. He tried to shield the twins from outsiders, but every attempt at secrecy only seemed to sharpen their abilities. It was as if the very act of hiding them amplified their awareness, like a seed left in the dark that grows faster than sunlight could ever allow. The town's gossip began to fester into fear. Rumors emerged that the twins were possessed, that they were agents of some unseen force testing humanity's limits. Some whispered about a family curse, others about ancient knowledge passed down in secret, a kind of forbidden inheritance that manifested not in wealth, but in mind and soul. Outsiders began to appear, drawn by curiosity, by the desire to study what they believed to be a miracle or an anomaly. Priests, scholars, even charlatans all arrived, each convinced they could understand or control or profit from the children. And each left shaken, changed, or broken. It was during this period that the first acts impossible to deny began to occur. One morning, a neighbor found her missing jewelry returned, arranged in a perfect pattern on her doorstep, items that had vanished months before. A man who had stolen money from the local church confessed publicly, claiming the twins had spoken to him in the night, reciting every misdeed he had committed. And the most terrifying incident of all, Emily predicted the sudden death of a child in the neighboring town, a boy she had never met. Hours later, the tragedy occurred exactly as she had described. Margaret and Thomas realized something their neighbors could not. Their children were not merely unusual. They were a force that could manipulate reality, or at least the perception of it, with terrifying precision. And worse, this force was alive, aware, and increasingly willful. Every attempt to control it only unleashed more. The Harper twins were no longer just children. They were an instrument of revelation, a mirror for hidden truths, a warning of what happens when knowledge is unbound. And now, as we go deeper, you must prepare yourself. In the next section, we uncover the first evidence that the twins' abilities were not only supernatural, they were intentionally altering the minds and actions of the adults around them. By the age of 9, the Harper twins had moved beyond prediction. The strange events, the uncanny foresight, now carried intent. The townsfolk began noticing patterns that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Men and women found themselves acting in ways they couldn't explain, compelled toward choices they didn't want to make, all while the twins watched with an unsettling calm. Emily would ask a simple question, and without realizing it, the listener would confess sins they had hidden for years. Edward would smile and nod, confirming details they didn't know he could possibly know. The effect was subtle at first, like a shadow across the mind. But then it became undeniable. The twins were shaping reality through the human will. Visitors, scientists, and priests alike began documenting these incidents, though their notes were laced with fear, uncertainty, and sometimes madness. One psychologist recorded an entire afternoon in which he intended to test the twins' memory. Within an hour, he was recounting his own private failures in front of the family, trembling and apologetic as though compelled by some invisible force. Another visitor, a local minister, left Ashbourne convinced that the children were vessels for some divine or infernal intelligence, though he could not decide which. And that uncertainty, that dangerous ambiguity, is precisely where their power thrived. The twins never commanded in the way adults understand. They didn't scream, they didn't threaten, they simply existed. And that existence was a lever on the mind. A man would enter a room certain of his convictions, and within minutes, leave questioning his own morality, his choices, even his identity. Margaret and Thomas, terrified parents trapped in a web of their own creation, watched as friends and relatives became instruments in a game they could not comprehend. And all the while, the twins retained the innocence of children, the perfect camouflage for forces no one could oppose. It was during this period that the townsfolk began leaving offerings at the Harper home. Jewelry, coins, gifts of food, small tokens to appease what they had begun calling the Watchers. Fear had become devotion, superstition masquerading as piety. And yet the twins did nothing overtly to claim this reverence. They simply existed. And every subtle gesture, every glance, every whisper was enough to bend human behavior like pliable clay. This was no longer a story of gifted children. This was a study in influence, in psychological dominion, in a power that transcended science, reason, and morality. By age 10, the Harper twins were no longer contained by the town, the family, or even the bounds of human understanding. They had become a phenomenon, a living test of the boundaries between mind and reality. It was a cold November evening when the Harper twins executed an act that would haunt Ashbourne for decades. A neighbor, a stoic man named Samuel Pritchard, had been skeptical of all the rumors. He mocked the whispers about the twins in public, laughed at the gifts and confessions, and even threatened to take legal action if the town continued what he called childish superstition. That night, he came to the Harper home, determined to confront Margaret and Thomas and to silence the madness once and for all. He did not leave alive. The official reports were vague. They claimed a sudden accident, a fall down the old well. behind the house. But the townspeople knew better. Those who witnessed the scene swore they saw Emily and Edward standing at the edge, silent, serene, their hands barely moving. Yet somehow, Samuel's body had been guided, manipulated, as if invisible strings had controlled every step he took. The investigators called it tragic coincidence, yet every detail, the timing, the trajectory, the look in the children's eyes, spoke of something far more sinister. Those who came near the twins afterward reported a tangible pressure, a sensation of their decisions being observed, measured, and quietly overridden. After Samuel's death, fear became obedience. The Harper home was treated like a shrine, and Margaret and Thomas were forced into complicity, understanding that their children were no longer just precocious. They were instruments of forces that defied logic, morality, and the natural world. Visitors approached with reverence or terror. Neighbors whispered in the streets about the children who bend reality. Even the local clergy, men of supposed divine authority, confessed privately to trembling in their presence. They said the twins carried a weight, a knowledge that made the Almighty themselves seem distant. But here is the truth that no one wrote down. The twins were not malevolent in the way humans understand evil. There was no cruelty in their intentions. They were operating on a level of awareness that treated the human psyche as malleable, the world as pliable, and consequences as inevitable. What we would call manipulation, they would have called observation. They were revealing truths by bending perception until it could no longer resist. And the terrifying part? They were learning, adapting, evolving. Every interaction, every lie, every hidden sin of Ashbourne's residents became fuel, sharpened in the fire of their understanding. This incident marked a turning point. The Harper twins were no longer merely a curiosity. They had become a force that could not be contained, studied, or tamed. And as we descend further into their story, you must prepare yourself for truths that challenge the foundation of what you think is real. In the next section, we explore the strange and terrifying rituals of knowledge the twins seem to practice in private. Rituals that hint at something far older and darker than even the adults could imagine. As the Harper twins grew, it became clear that their extraordinary abilities were not random. They were deliberate, cultivated, and horrifyingly precise. Neighbors began noticing strange habits, late-night walks into the forest, whispers carried through open windows, patterns drawn in the dirt that seemed to follow no earthly logic. Margaret and Thomas, already living in fear, tried to monitor these activities, but the children always eluded them, moving like shadows with purpose, guided by a knowledge far older than the family itself. Those patterns, those repeated rituals, were not play. They were exercises in power, tiny acts that bent perception, influenced thought, and amplified the twins' reach beyond what any ordinary child could imagine. Scholars who arrived later speculated that these rituals had roots in a kind of forbidden knowledge lost to time, practices whispered about in medieval grimoires, hidden in the margins of religious texts, dismissed as superstition. The twins' actions suggested an innate understanding of principles that humans had long forgotten. The ability to align attention, will, and observation into a force that could subtly shape reality. Every gesture, every word, every glance was an experiment in control, and the results were undeniable. Adults in their presence began acting against their own interests, revealing truths, confessing sins, and performing actions the twins had never told them to do. Yet the outcome aligned precisely with the twins' intentions. Margaret and Thomas were living witnesses to the impossible. Every night, they would check on their children, only to find themselves caught in a psychological web too intricate to escape. The twins never raised their voices. They never forced anyone's hand. Instead, they created conditions under which the human mind willingly surrendered its agency. Friends, neighbors, scientists, clergy, They all became instruments, unwitting participants in a system the twins had perfected. And this system was not merely for observation, it was a method of influence, of awakening awareness. And some whispered of judgment. The most unsettling truth was that the twins themselves seemed unaware of any moral boundaries. They operated according to principles of cause and effect beyond comprehension, treating human behavior as a kind of malleable substance. They were mirrors and levers, revealing secrets no one wanted exposed and compelling action in ways that felt both natural and terrifying. Some who encountered them described a sensation of being measured, tested, and found wanting. Not by a person, but by an intelligence that had no human empathy, no human flaw, only cold, deliberate precision. As we continue, you will see how these rituals escalated, moving from subtle manipulation to acts that reshape the very fabric of their small town. And now, halfway through this descent, I want you to pause and engage. Type the phrase, "The shadows speak," twice in the comments below. Do it. Let it anchor your awareness. It is more than participation. It is a symbolic step into the truth you are now confronting. By the time the Harper twins reached 11, Ashbourne could no longer pretend their presence was innocent. Whispers turned into panic. The subtle manipulations that once unnerved neighbors had escalated into events that could not be ignored. A baker, who had mocked the children's abilities, found his shop ransacked the next morning, though nothing of value was taken. Instead, the goods were arranged into symbols that no one in the town recognized, yet every adult who saw them felt a cold certainty. They were warnings. The twins did not speak the messages aloud. They didn't need to. The arrangement itself carried authority, bending the minds of those who observed it. The first public confrontation occurred at the town meeting. Dozens of residents had gathered, furious, demanding answers. They expected fear, tears, perhaps childish excuses. Instead, Emily and Edward stood silently at the edge of the room. And then, without a single word, events began to unfold. Arguments erupted among the adults, each person exposing their deepest secrets, confessing betrayals, admitting fears they had long hidden. The twins' eyes followed each revelation, calm, almost clinical, as though documenting every detail for some higher purpose. Chaos filled the chamber not through shouting, but through the invisible pressure of truth, the undeniable exposure of every hidden sin. Observers described a sensation unlike any other. Time seemed elastic. Thoughts, normally private and fleeting, were drawn to the surface. Men and women found themselves compelled to act in ways they had never intended. It was as though the twins had aligned reality itself with an unseen moral compass. Skeptics tried to argue, to reason, to discredit, but every attempt collapsed under the weight of undeniable outcomes. Decisions, confessions, and confrontations unfolded exactly as if the twins had orchestrated them, yet no one could prove intent. Margaret and Thomas, standing at the back, watched in horror. The children they had borne were no longer confined to their household. They had become a force of reckoning, a mechanism of revelation that exposed corruption, greed, fear, and sin wherever human minds hid them. And the terrifying part: the twins themselves seemed unaware of the destruction they caused. They were instruments, conduits, for an intelligence that operated beyond conventional morality, beyond human comprehension. By the end of that day, Ashbourne had shifted. Fear replaced skepticism. Reverence replaced mockery. The Harper twins had moved from anomaly to authority, bending reality with subtlety and precision. And this was only the beginning. The next section will reveal the origins of their power, or at least what the town later whispered as its source, a dark, forbidden inheritance that hints at forces older than the United States itself. Even as the town of Ashbourne tried to reconcile what they had witnessed, rumors began to surface. Rumors that hinted at origins far older than the Harper family itself. Some claimed the twins were the last heirs of a forgotten bloodline, one that had survived secret rites dating back centuries. Others whispered of covenants made in the shadows of Europe, pacts with knowledge so ancient it was considered heretical, forbidden even to speak aloud. Margaret and Thomas refused to acknowledge these whispers, but privately, they began to wonder if the children's abilities were a product of inheritance rather than chance. It was not just the knowledge, the prediction, or the manipulation that unnerved people. It was the precision of it. The Harper twins seemed to operate according to a logic older than human reason, as if the world itself conformed to their observation. Historians would later speculate that the twins were tapping into something called the unseen structure, a hidden architecture of causality that connected human thoughts, actions, and destiny in ways science could not measure. Those who tried to trace it mathematically or psychologically were driven to despair, for the equations always collapsed, the models failed, and the phenomena remained untouchable. Locals told stories of artifacts in the Harper household, books no one could read, symbols etched into the floorboards, intricate patterns in the garden that shifted overnight. Scholars who managed to glimpse these objects described them as uncanny, alive even, reacting to the observer's attention, reshaping themselves subtly in response to scrutiny. The twins were often found near these objects, silent, absorbed, performing rituals no adult could interpret. Some suggested these practices were a form of training, a deliberate alignment of mind, intention, and reality that allowed them to influence others with terrifying subtlety. Others whispered darker possibilities, that the children were vessels, conduits for forces that had been guiding humanity from the shadows for centuries. No one outside the Harper home knew the full truth, and perhaps that was intentional. The children themselves never explained, never justified, never warned. They simply acted, observed, and evolved. Those who entered their world felt a profound disorientation, a sense of being measured against something eternal, something indifferent to human morality or law. Even Margaret and Thomas, who had given birth to them, could only watch in awe and terror, understanding that their children were no longer fully human, or at least no longer fully subject to human understanding. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. Travelers passing through Ashbourne began reporting unusual incidents. A man on business from Philadelphia swore he was compelled to change his route mid-journey, stopping in a town he had never intended to visit. There he encountered an event so precise, so inexplicably aligned with warnings he had dismissed, that he left shaken, unable to explain why he had been guided to that place at that exact time. Word spread quietly at first, and then like wildfire. The Harper twins were no longer contained within their home or their town. They were a force whose reach extended beyond geography, beyond simple cause and effect. Margaret and Thomas, already exhausted by years of fear and vigilance, began to notice patterns in letters, messages, and sightings from distant friends and acquaintances. Each report hinted at subtle influence, choices altered, confessions made, accidents avoided or engineered, all pointing to a guiding hand that could not belong to ordinary children. Scholars who investigated concluded that the twins' abilities were no longer mere phenomena. They were mechanisms of reality manipulation, operating with a precision that defied all known laws. And what terrified them most was the implication. If the twins could influence distant events, even minimally, they were operating on a scale that humans could neither measure nor resist. The first fully documented incident occurred when a factory fire in a neighboring county was averted, not by human intervention, but by the precise redirection of workers' actions. Investigators were puzzled, finding no alarms triggered, no orders given, and no apparent cause for the sudden coordination that prevented disaster. The only common thread: several employees had recently passed through Ashbourne and claimed to have felt something during their stay, a subtle pressure, an unseen guidance that had nudged them toward safety. Those who later reflected on the events described the Harper twins without knowing their names, recalling children whose eyes seemed to know too much, whose presence had compelled action without command. It was becoming clear that the Harper twins operated according to laws humans were incapable of perceiving. They were not simply aware of events, they were capable of influencing them, bending threads of reality like invisible hands shaping a loom. Margaret and Thomas understood this truth quietly, privately, and with growing dread. The twins' reach could extend to anyone, anywhere, at any moment. And if they were learning, adapting, and evolving as they grew, the world itself had only begun to feel their influence. It was inevitable. A force like the Harper twins could not remain hidden forever. Word reached the ears of powerful outsiders, scholars, occultists, even government agents, each hungry to study, exploit, or control the children. At first they came under the guise of research, claiming science, psychology, or education as their motive. But the Harper family quickly realized that curiosity was never neutral. Each visitor carried ambition, a desire to harness what could not be contained, and every approach unleashed subtle waves of tension, fear, and resistance. The twins, as always, observed, and as always they responded. The first formal attempt to study them ended in disaster. A renowned psychologist brought extensive testing equipment and a team of assistants, believing he could map, measure, and categorize the twins' abilities. Within hours, the team began to unravel. One assistant experienced vivid visions of past tragedies he had never witnessed. Another suddenly confessed crimes long buried, sobbing uncontrollably. The psychologist himself began questioning his own identity, unsure whether he was observing the twins or being observed by them. By the end of the week, the researchers left Ashbourne, their reputations ruined, their careers stalled, their minds haunted by truths they could not unsee. It became clear that the Harper twins were not objects to be studied. They were active, participants in the world's hidden machinery, capable of shaping human thought and behavior without a single word. Ambition, greed, and fear became amplified around them, drawing out secrets, lies, and vulnerabilities. Entire communities began to change subtly under their influence. Those who sought to control the twins found themselves manipulated instead. Their plans turned against them. Even Margaret and Thomas, desperate to protect their children, were caught in this invisible web, understanding that any interference risked unleashing forces beyond their comprehension. Rumors spread of distant institutions attempting to intervene. Letters from universities, government agents, and esoteric societies, but each attempt ended in chaos, misfortune, or inexplicable psychological collapse. The twins were not malevolent in the human sense. They were instruments of something larger. Mechanism that revealed, corrected, or punished with precision that humans could neither anticipate nor resist. The very act of approaching them with intention became a trap, a test of character and consequence. The Harper twins were no longer merely anomalies. They were a mirror of hidden forces, a measure of ambition, desire, and fear. Every interaction, every observer became part of their subtle system of influence. And as we continue, we will uncover the first incident where their power intersected with institutional authority, demonstrating that no social structure, no law, no human hierarchy could stand against the quiet inevitability of their knowledge. By the time the Harper twins were 13, their reach had grown beyond the town, beyond the casual curiosity of outsiders, and into the corridors of authority itself. Local officials, once skeptical, now approached with caution, fear hidden behind bureaucratic language. Reports arrived of minor accidents, confessions, and inexplicable decisions throughout Ashbourne, all traced, if one dared trace, them to the subtle influence of the twins. Schools, churches, and businesses began to feel a quiet instability. Those in power, who believed they understood the world, found themselves second-guessing every choice, their decisions bending without explanation. The first documented instance of institutional disruption occurred at the town council. Officials intended to enforce new regulations that many townspeople opposed. Yet, during the meeting, the council members began arguing in ways that revealed decades of corruption, secret deals, and betrayals they had long hidden. Each revelation came precisely as the twins had silently directed, exposing lies with surgical precision. By the meeting's end, laws intended to govern the town had been subverted, not by rebellion or protest, but by the subtle manipulation of perception and will. Observers later described a feeling of inevitability in the room, as if the truth had been preordained, and no human authority could resist it. Outside Ashbourne, whispers spread quickly. Scholars wrote cautiously about unexplained influence, while religious leaders debated whether the twins were instruments of divine justice or harbingers of something darker. Some feared outright that their abilities were a form of ancient, forbidden knowledge, remnants of a system of control older than modern civilization. Others speculated that the twins had become conduits for collective human secrets, a living archive that reflected the hidden sins, ambitions, and fears of anyone who encountered them. The twins themselves remained outwardly calm. They did not boast. They did not threaten. Their power was in observation and presence, subtle, deliberate, and unrelenting. Adults often left their presence with the sense that decisions had been made for them, that hidden threads had been pulled, and that the world itself had shifted imperceptibly but irrevocably. Margaret and Thomas, who had once hoped to shield their children, now understood that concealment was impossible. The twins were not merely part of the world. They were instruments through which the world's hidden forces were made visible. By 14. The Harper twins had evolved beyond subtle influence. They had become catalysts, forces that revealed the dark machinery of human ambition. A wealthy landowner, known for underhanded deals and ruthless manipulation, arrived in Ashbourne intending to study, or perhaps control, the children. Within hours, his empire of deceit began to unravel. Deals he had orchestrated for decades collapsed. Allies turned against him, and secrets he had buried for years emerged with surgical precision. Those who observed this breakdown described it as if the twins had reached inside his mind and exposed every hidden sin, every calculation, every concealed desire, leaving him powerless before the invisible tribunal of their awareness. Emily and Edward did not speak commands. They did not touch, threaten, or manipulate overtly. Their power was a quiet force, a precision of presence and observation that bent perception and action. The landowner found himself acting against his own interest, revealing truths he had intended to conceal, compelled by a subtle weight pressing on his will. By the time he fled Ashbourne, he was a broken man, publicly humiliated, privately haunted, a warning to anyone who sought to exploit what they did not understand. This incident marked a turning point in the town's, and indeed the world's, relationship with the twins. People realized that their influence could not be bargained with, purchased, or contained. Greed, ambition, pride, human traits considered strengths, became liabilities in their presence. The Harper twins had become mirrors of hidden corruption, instruments of exposure, and silent arbiters of morality. Those who entered their orbit were compelled to confront not only the children's uncanny abilities, but their own hidden truths, their unspoken fears, and their suppressed desires. Even Margaret and Thomas recognized that their children were no longer confined by family, town, or human expectation. The twins had transcended the ordinary, operating according to principles of influence that defied morality, law, and reason. Every action, every glance, every silence became a mechanism to test, to measure, and to expose. The adults around them were no longer the dominant actors. They were instruments, marionettes in a system whose logic only the twins seemed to understand. By 15, the Harper twins had become impossible to ignore. Word of their abilities had reached beyond Ashbourne, drawing attention from universities, religious institutions, and even regional authorities. They arrived with the intention of studying, classifying, and, if possible, controlling what they could not understand. But the twins, as always, responded not with defiance, but with precision. They observed, and the adults unfolded. Decisions were altered, plans collapsed, truths long buried were revealed. It was as if the twins had learned to measure human intent, to bend it subtly, until the adults themselves acted as instruments of the very knowledge they sought to contain. He first documented confrontation with institutional authority occurred during a university-led study. Professors arrived with tests, interviews, and psychological assessments, expecting to map the children's minds. Within hours, they were confessing personal failings, recalling hidden sins, and revealing secrets that left the entire team paralyzed. Observers described the effect as a quiet unraveling. Men of science, so accustomed to control and reason, reduced to trembling witnesses before children who had never formally taught them anything. The twins were not merely aware, they were active participants in the world's hidden architecture, shaping perception, thought, and action with uncanny precision. Religious authorities attempted similar engagement, entering the Harper home, with prayers, rituals, and sacred texts meant to anchor morality. Within moments, priests and ministers found themselves questioning doctrine, confessing hypocrisies, and reconsidering the limits of divine authority. The children's presence was a silent force exposing hidden corruption, moral weakness, and ambition without uttering a single word. Even the most steadfast leaders left humbled, disturbed, and profoundly changed, their own institutions rendered fragile before what could not be categorized or contained. Every interaction became a test, a revelation, a subtle recalibration of human behavior. The Harper twins were no longer just remarkable children. They were living instruments of exposure, mirrors reflecting the darkest truths of anyone who came into contact with them. Margaret and Thomas, increasingly powerless, could only watch as outsiders fell into patterns of vulnerability the twins seemed to orchestrate without conscious effort. It was clear these children were conduits for forces older, deeper, and more precise than human systems of control. By 16, the Harper twins' reach had grown beyond Ashbourne, and the consequences of their presence began to ripple outward, touching institutions, businesses, and political networks. What had once been subtle influence, the quiet unmasking of secrets, the reshaping of decisions, had evolved into deliberate orchestration. Events unfolded precisely as the twins observed and nudged them, revealing truths and outcomes that human ambition could neither predict nor control. Even the most powerful and calculating minds became instruments in their invisible game, unaware that the children had rewritten the rules before anyone could intervene. One incident, documented in private correspondence later discovered in Ashbourne archives, illustrates the terrifying scope of their abilities. A regional council planned a major land deal that would have enriched a select few while dispossessing others. The Harper twins, though still children, subtly influenced the negotiators. Over the course of days, through carefully placed suggestions, glances, and questions, never overt commands, they shifted decisions, realigned loyalties, and ensured that the council's intended outcome collapsed. By the time the meeting concluded, the original plan had been completely reversed, yet no one could explain why. Those involved would later report a strange sense of inevitability, a silent hand guiding their choices, leaving them both awed and terrified. This pattern repeated in other domains. Merchants acted against their own profit motives. Officials confessed hidden corruption, and clergy reconsidered doctrines with unsettling honesty. Everywhere the twins appeared, human ambition faltered, and the machinery of control revealed its weakness. The children were no longer just observers or mirrors. They were agents of a subtle but absolute force, exposing the fragility of human systems while simultaneously bending them toward outcomes only they could foresee. Margaret and Thomas, increasingly aware of the implications, began documenting these events secretly, hoping to leave a record in case the twins' abilities were misunderstood or exploited in the future. They understood that the twins were conduits for a form of knowledge older than any living system, a force that operated outside morality, reason, and law. The world had never encountered such precision in the manipulation of human thought and behavior, and it was terrifying in its inevitability. By 17, a pattern had emerged. Anyone who sought to study, control, or exploit the Harper twins suffered consequences that were as precise as they were terrifying. Scientists lost credibility, scholars abandoned careers, and even men of religion, accustomed to authority and ritual, were forced to confront truths that left them psychologically unmoored. Their minds unraveled, not through violence or threat, but through an invisible, inescapable force. A quiet revelation that exposed every hidden weakness, every suppressed desire, and every moral failing. The twins had become arbiters of human frailty, capable of measuring character with absolute precision and revealing it to the world in subtle, devastating ways. One renowned psychologist, whose name has been deliberately omitted from records, attempted a series of cognitive tests to map the twins' abilities. Within hours, he experienced a cascade of hallucinations, vivid memories that were not his own, and confessions surfacing from the depths of his mind, sins he had hidden even from himself. By the end of the experiment, he left Ashbourne a broken man, publicly discredited and privately haunted. Colleagues speculated stress or mental illness, but the town whispered the truth. He had faced the Harper twins, and his own mind had betrayed him. The pattern repeated with government agents who tried to assess the twins' potential threat. Reports surfaced of inexplicable errors in judgment, sudden confessions of misconduct, and irreversible changes in career trajectories. Even ordinary townspeople who had attempted minor exploitation of the twins found their lives subtly but permanently altered. The children did not act with vengeance in the human sense. They simply existed, observing, reflecting, and allowing outcomes that exposed hidden truths. And the cost of ignoring this presence, or worse, attempting to dominate it, was invariably catastrophic. Margaret and Thomas, by now resigned to the inevitability of these events, began keeping meticulous records of the transformations occurring around their children. They recognized the danger, the power, and the absolute inevitability of the twins' influence. The Harper twins were no longer just children. They were instruments of revelation, exposing every hidden flaw, every unspoken ambition, and every suppressed fear, bending reality to mirror what humans refuse to acknowledge. By 18, the Harper twins' influence had quietly begun to reach beyond the borders of Ashbourne. Letters, rumors, and occasional witnesses revealed a disturbing pattern. Decisions made by officials, businessmen, and scholars, hundreds of miles away, bore the fingerprints of unseen guidance. Some travelers reported an uncanny feeling during their visits, a subtle compulsion to act in ways they could not explain. Soon, incidents emerged that defied any rational explanation. A shipment rerouted with perfect timing, a conflict averted before it began, confessions surfacing in distant courts that seemed to align precisely with what the twins had observed. The Harper twins' method remained consistent: silent observation, subtle intervention, and the quiet bending of human perception. No direct commands were given, no threats were issued. Yet the results were undeniable. Human ambition, greed, fear, and deception began to unravel under their watchful gaze. A prominent merchant attempting to consolidate wealth found his decisions inexplicably sabotaged. A minor government official confessed wrongdoing he had hidden for years. A scientist abandoned a risky experiment he had coveted. In each case, there was no obvious manipulation, only an invisible alignment of circumstances, a subtle nudge that guided choices toward an outcome the observer could not resist. Margaret and Thomas, watching their children, recognized that the Yai twins were not just extraordinary, they were unprecedented. The scale and precision of their influence suggested principles of reality that humans were incapable of perceiving, much less controlling. They were conduits for a force that transcended ordinary morality, reason, and law, operating with surgical accuracy on the minds and actions of anyone who came within its orbit. Even attempts to understand or measure it scientifically were futile. The twins adapted, shifted, and evolved faster than observation could track. Those who encountered them, consciously or unknowingly, became part of a system far larger than themselves, a network of human behavior subtly guided by something older, deeper, and more intelligent than humanity could comprehend. And the most terrifying aspect of all, the twins were still children, yet their presence had become a silent arbiter of truth, morality, and consequence. The world had only begun to feel the reach of their abilities, and those who attempted to challenge or exploit them invariably paid a profound personal price. By 19, the Harper twins' abilities had become impossible to ignore even at institutional levels. Their influence was no longer subtle, it was systemic. Officials, scholars, and clergy who sought to study or manipulate them found themselves undone in ways that defied logic. Decisions were overturned, plans unraveled, and secrets, long buried, were exposed with surgical precision. The twins did not act with malice. They acted with observation and intention, bending human perception and will in ways that revealed the fragility of every structure, every hierarchy, every authority. One documented incident involved a regional court attempting to prosecute a case against a prominent merchant. Evidence that had been meticulously fabricated fell apart inexplicably. Witnesses contradicted themselves, documents disappeared or changed, and the presiding judge admitted in private that he had experienced memories and confessions that were not his own. Those present later swore that the twins' presence, though miles away, had guided the chain of events, shaping outcomes without direct intervention. Rational explanations were impossible. The system had been subtly rewritten by a force no human could resist or comprehend. Educational institutions faced similar disruption. Professors who sought to categorize or experiment on the twins found themselves confessing personal secrets or abandoning entire research projects. Their ambitions, reputations, and carefully constructed facades crumbled, all under the quiet influence of children who never raised their voices. Even clergy, who had once attempted to measure or contain the twins through prayer and ritual, reported unsettling doubts and revelations that shook their faith and authority. Human systems, legal, educational, spiritual, were proving remarkably vulnerable to forces they could not perceive, much less control. Margaret and Thomas, by this point, understood the scope of what they were raising. The twins were not merely precocious children. They were conduits for an intelligence that measured morality, ambition, and truth, exposing weaknesses with unerring precision. No hierarchy could withstand them, no plan could survive intact, and no human ambition could escape scrutiny. The twins had become arbiters of consequence, silently testing the world's structures, revealing both corruption and potential in equal measure. By 20, a clear pattern had emerged. Anyone who sought to challenge, manipulate, or even simply understand the Harper twins suffered profound psychological consequences. It was not punishment in the ordinary sense. There was no violence, no threat, but a meticulous, unavoidable revelation of truth. Ambition crumbled under scrutiny. pride faltered. Secrets long buried surfaced, exposing every hidden flaw. The twins had become invisible judges, their observation alone compelling honesty, accountability, and transformation. And for those unprepared, the consequences were devastating. One government official, attempting to assess the twins' potential threat to regional stability, found himself recounting personal betrayals, ethical lapses, and decisions that had harmed others, without realizing he had revealed them. Each confession seemed compelled, inevitable, as though an unseen force had aligned his mind against himself. Colleagues later described him as unrecognizable, changed fundamentally in his worldview. Another case involved a wealthy industrialist, whose attempts to exploit the twins for financial gain ended in total collapse. Business ventures failed, allies turned against him, and he became consumed by anxiety and guilt he could not explain. Even ordinary townspeople were not immune. Simple interactions with the twins revealed hidden truths, fears, and weaknesses, leaving people unsettled, introspective, and forever altered. The twins' power was not coercion, it was revelation. They reflected humanity's darkest, most hidden aspects with brutal precision, forcing those around them to confront what they had spent their lives concealing. For some, this led to humility, self-examination, and change. For others, it brought despair, isolation, and a persistent sense that reality itself had shifted beneath their feet. Margaret and Thomas, increasingly aware of the magnitude of their children's influence, documented these psychological transformations meticulously, hoping to preserve some understanding of the phenomenon for future generations. They realized the Harper twins were not just extraordinary. They were instruments of a force older and more precise than human comprehension, capable of altering not only actions but the very architecture of thought, perception, and belief. By the early 20s, the Harper twins' presence had transformed Ashbourne and its surrounding regions in ways no human authority could fully grasp. Communities operated differently, institutions functioned with unusual transparency, and decisions, once driven by ambition, greed, or fear, were subtly redirected by the invisible architecture the twins had introduced. Those who had encountered them carried lasting impressions, a psychological imprint of awareness that reshaped behavior, morality, and perception. Emily and Edward had become more than individuals, they were catalysts for systemic revelation. Historians who later attempted to trace these changes found patterns too subtle, too precise to explain with ordinary sociology or psychology. Businesses that had once thrived on secrecy faltered. Political decisions aligned in ways that seemed preordained. Clergy reported a persistent sense of accountability among congregations, a quiet self-regulation that defied doctrine. The twins' influence had extended beyond direct contact. They had reshaped human behavior at a structural level, leaving echoes of their presence in institutions, communities, and the collective psyche. Margaret and Thomas, long resigned to the impossibility of containment, understood that their children were now arbiters of an invisible moral and cognitive architecture. They were conduits for forces older than Ashbourne, forces that measured truth, revealed hidden ambition, and imposed subtle, inevitable consequences. The twins' influence was no longer experimental or localized. It had become systemic, permanent, and self-reinforcing. Every individual who had fallen under their gaze contributed to a network of behavioral realignment, a lattice of awareness and accountability that could never be undone. Even in death or eventual separation, the Harper twins' presence continued to resonate. Stories of their interventions, once dismissed as rumor, became cautionary tales. The subtle, silent mechanisms they had initiated persisted, shaping human action long after direct contact ceased. Communities learned, often unconsciously, to navigate the world with a heightened sense of perception, moral consequence, and awareness of forces beyond ordinary understanding. Emily and Edward had left an imprint, a legacy that altered reality itself, challenging assumptions about free will, morality, and the limits of human comprehension. The story of the Harper twins is not merely a tale of extraordinary children, it is a lesson in the fragility of human perception, the malleability of will, and the invisible forces that shape reality around us. Emily and Edward did not conquer the world with brute force or spectacle. They operated through observation, subtlety, and the quiet alignment of human behavior with hidden truths. Their presence revealed what we rarely admit: that morality, ambition, and fear are not only internal constructs, they are threads in a web far larger, far older, and far more precise than any human mind can control. Those who encountered the twins, knowingly or unknowingly, discovered that reality itself could bend to observation. Decisions shifted, secrets surfaced, ambitions collapsed, and perceptions were realigned. The twins were arbiters of consequence, mirrors of hidden truths, and catalysts for awareness. They exposed the illusions we cling to, forcing individuals and institutions alike to confront the fragile structures upon which they rely. And this is the most dangerous knowledge. The world is not as solid as we believe. Human systems, moral frameworks, and even personal identity can be manipulated, observed, and subtly redirected by forces we cannot measure, and perhaps by children we underestimate. For men who seek mastery over self, understanding the Harper twins offers a lesson in vigilance, perception, and humility. Power is not always wielded in the form of dominance. Sometimes it is quiet, precise, and unrelenting, exercised through knowledge, observation, and the ability to align intention with consequence. The twins remind us that awareness alone is a force, capable of reshaping not only those around us, but the structures and systems we inhabit. To underestimate subtlety is to surrender to it. To ignore observation is to be observed, measured, and often transformed. As you reflect on their story, understand this: the Harper twins did not break humanity. They revealed its hidden architecture. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Every decision, every secret, every ambition becomes part of a lattice of influence, consequence, and observation. The world is not as random, as chaotic, or as controlled as we believe. Forces exist, hidden, deliberate, and precise, that bend reality to align with truth, testing the moral, mental, and psychological fibers of those they touch. You have descended into a forbidden truth, a knowledge few encounter and even fewer survive unchanged. Remember the phrase you typed earlier: the shadows speak. Let it anchor your awareness, a reminder that observation, influence, and truth are forces far more powerful than the ordinary mind can grasp. The Harper twins are gone from Ashbourne, but their legacy remains embedded in the very structure of human choice and consequence. And now, having seen the mechanics behind what most call coincidence, chance, or fate, you understand. Reality is not fixed. It is measured, observed, and subtly guided. The question is, will you awaken to that truth, or will you continue to sleep within its web? The descent ends here, but for those who pay attention, the awakening has only just begun.